There's something in this world that holds you like nothing else, that evokes change and has the power to move you. A force so powerful it cannot be opposed by nations, religion, or military force. It holds, it clings, it sticks to you. It's the power of story.
You know, there are different moments in history that I really wish I could have been a part of. Just to be there with those people and to hear what was said firsthand and to see it and just to experience with them. You know, I've always been a sports fan all my life. And I've seen clips of the speech. I've read the manuscript of the speech. But I always have wondered, what would it have been like to sit in Yankee Stadium when Lou Gehrig gave his farewell address? When over those loudspeakers, he proclaimed to a whole stadium of people that no matter what had gone wrong in his life, he was still the luckiest man alive. I've always wanted to just sit in the corner of the room as the Declaration of Independence was being signed, to watch how already brave men would stiffen up and just be a little more courageous and promise themselves they were going to be free. But you know, more than any moment in our political history, more than any sports moment, or over any moment in my family history, if I could go back for just one thing, I really wish I could just sit once and hear Jesus teach firsthand. Just to look up and hear it from his mouth in real time. Like this one time, Jesus was out and he was conducting his ministry and doing some teaching. And he, on that day, was really addressing some pretty heavy-hitting topics on life and how we view our time on earth. And then, as soon as there was this lull in Jesus' thought pattern, a man from the crowd interjects. He says, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance in half with me." Well, Jesus just looks at this man and said, "Who appointed me to be the judge over your family squabble over money?" But then he looks out. Maybe he looks at the whole crowd. Maybe he glances at the disciples. Or maybe he looks right at the man that asked the question. And he issued this very direct warning about greed and the negative impact it has in the life of anyone, regardless of whether they're a believer or not. And then Jesus tells a story. And in the parable that Jesus told on this day, the main character was a farmer. And he was a highly successful farmer. When the passage started, it noted that he was already wealthy. But one year, he realized that the barns and the structures he had already built weren't going to be big enough to hold the crop he was going to be bringing in. So the farmer, he kind of surveyed the situation. And he decided that he would tear down everything he had already built to build bigger and better barns to hold even more wealth. But then at that point, he would sit back and enjoy the good life and reflect on all he had accomplished. Now, as Jesus tells the story, what that man doesn't realize is that God's going to demand his life to end. And he won't ever get to enjoy his wealth. But more tragically, there's going to be no one left behind him that was impacted by him or his life's work to enjoy an inheritance either. And then as he finishes the story, Jesus looks back out at the crowd and says, "Look, just like that man, no matter what you accomplish in life, if you don't invest in your relationship with Jesus Christ, then just like him, everything else you accomplish ends with you as well." You know, there's something so powerful about stories and storytelling. You see, Jesus caught that while principles and facts stick in our heads, a story connects with our hearts, and those principles take an even greater root. You see, when we look at this passage today, and it's found in Luke chapter 12, verses 13 through 18. So if you brought your Bibles, go ahead and flip there, because we're going to circle back and kind of break that passage down kind of chunk by chunk. But if you look at the story itself, or the parable itself, it's only 5 verses long. Not long at all. And in 5 verses, Jesus could have given us 5 bullet points. Just 5 well-written statements on greed and investing wisely, and what are we doing to leave a greater impact behind us. Could have given us 5 sentences. He could have written a 5-sentence or a 5-verse article, much like a modern-day blog post on the negative impact on greed in the life of a believer. He could have done all that, but Jesus chose to tell a story because he knew the truth would stick if he could connect it to their hearts. Right? Now, we're all familiar with storytelling today. We all use storytelling today. Stories are told for a variety of reasons today in our culture. Sometimes we tell stories because they're entertaining. It's just fun. Sometimes it's just fun to tell or to hear a story. Like many nights when I tuck my kids into bed, I will kneel down next to my daughter's bed and I will tell the Princess Manny story. And in the Princess Manny story, the entire kingdom goes out and searches for and then brings into the palace the finest M&Ms and Diet Coke for the princess to enjoy. However, the princess can only enjoy them when the queen's not in the palace to monitor the family's nutritional intake. Right? But sometimes it's just fun to tell or to hear a story. Sometimes we tell stories because there's a hero as a character, and they give us an example to follow, and we can tell a story, and we can embody those characteristics into our own life. And we can become a little more like the hero in that story as well. Sometimes we tell a story because we don't want to be like the main character. We tell a story about someone who did something and it got a result that we don't want to live with. And that's the reality of our parable today. Is that we don't want to go down the same path that the farmer did. Not because of what he accomplished was bad, but because what he didn't accomplish and what he didn't invest in left him with a result that we don't want to repeat in our lives today. And so as we look at this passage and as we circle back to the text, I've kind of frameworked our time together today around 3 questions. And these aren't fill-in-the-blank questions that we get a direct answer to. They're questions that we learn from and we take with us to help us examine our own lives. They're questions that we answer later on tonight, later on this week. They're meant for us to think on because an honest answer to these questions will show us which path we're headed down. Are we going to end up like the farmer in the story, having done so well in one area, but failed so miserably in a more important area? Or can we get ourselves on a path to where what we do accomplish spiritually far outweighs any other accomplishment we have in life? So we're going to break down the text using these 3 questions. The first question we're going to ask ourselves is, what am I holding on to? Just simply, what am I holding on to? As we start looking at this, I want us to read from Luke chapter 12, and we're going to read verses 13 through 15. And here Luke writes, "Someone in the crowd said to him, 'Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me.' But Jesus said, 'Man, who made me a judge or arbitrator over you?' And Jesus said to them, 'Take care and be on your guard against all greed, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions.'" So as our story starts out, and like I mentioned just a moment ago, in the first part of Luke chapter 12, Jesus is teaching, and he is addressing some incredibly difficult topics that we have to address in our spiritual life. And what I believe likely took place is when there was a lull in Jesus' thought pattern, this man pipes up. He's going to grab the moment, and he says, "Teacher, Tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me. And you see, I believe this man showed up on purpose. I don't think he was just wandering around and happened to run into a place where Jesus was teaching and this dawned on him. No, I think he knew where Jesus was going to be, and he showed up, and as soon as he could, he got Jesus' attention. And he calls him teacher, or another word in the Jewish language to describe the same role was rabbi. Right now, in this worldview or in this culture, there's no distinction between the spiritual realm and the more secular or just every day-to-day living. They're all intermingled. And the rabbi or the teacher was supposed to interpret the law based how it applied to specific circumstances and situations. So this man shows up where Jesus is teaching because he's a respected teacher of the law in many people's eyes. He shows up where he's teaching, hoping that Jesus will endorse his agenda to gain more of the inheritance. And like I just mentioned a moment ago, Jesus flat out declines the opportunity. Not because he doesn't care, but because he's got a greater purpose in his life and ministry. He's got a kingdom to build for his Father, and he's going to stick to why he was sent here. So Jesus says, no, I'm not here to judge your family squabble. But then he immediately issues a very direct and punchy warning against greed in the lives of a believer. Now, one way I define greed is when we take an aspect of our lives or a resource and we grip our hands so tight around it. And the only reason we think about loosening that grip is to either find a way to hold it more securely or just to gain more of it to hold and grip again. Right? And when I define greed that way, it reminds me of a shopping trip I was on with my family. Now, many of us have been here. You're walking through the mall. You've about purchased everything you didn't come for in the first place, and you're getting ready to go home. And as parents, you've also been in this situation to where all that's taking place, and then suddenly your child or one of your children decides they're not going to walk anymore. And at that point, it's simply not worth the emotional energy to teach them the life lesson of perseverance and to continue walking through the mall. And we had hit that point. And we're walking through the mall, and Manny Grace, my sweet little daughter, she looks up and says, "Daddy, would you hold me?" And I said, "Absolutely." And that day, instead of just carrying her, I put her on my shoulders, something we had done all the time. And we're walking through the store, and we hop on an escalator. And at this point, we're already a couple stories up in this mall. And we get about halfway up that escalator, and I can look down, and there's a gap between the edge of the escalator and the wall on the other side, and it's a sizable gap. And I'm not a real anxious person. I don't spook real easy. But when I saw that gap, and when I could see all the way to the floor of that mall, 3 stories down, all of a sudden, I couldn't hold on to her legs tight enough. And the only reason I would have changed my grip was if I thought there was a way to hold on to her tighter. And that's what greed can become in our spiritual lives. We can look at any aspect or any resource we possess, and we can begin to hold on to that so tightly that if even God were to challenge us to loosen the grip, it would be a significant struggle in our spiritual walk with the Lord. And we don't know exactly what the financial arrangement was on the inheritance, but one thing I know is that God knows our thoughts and He knows our hearts. So I'm very comfortable in saying that when this man asked that Jesus command the inheritance to be divided up between the two, that greed for financial wealth had entered that man's heart as he asked the question. I can say that because Jesus immediately follows that line of questioning with a warning on greed. So I believe it was there, and the warning still rings true today. And in one sentence, Jesus gives us a couple things we need to remember about greed. First, Jesus says, watch out. Be aware. Now, it's possible that you could be going through life and going through your spiritual walk in your day-to-day and just kind of recognize some greed. just kind of like it popped up. But I think Jesus also presents us with a more aggressive model, that we be on the lookout, that we be auditing our hearts and our attitudes and make sure that we're watching for areas to where greed has latched on to something God has given us. Right now, here in the Metro East, we live in kind of a populated area. There's a lot of traffic, there's a lot of industry, a lot of people. But it's also somewhat of a wooded area. So it's common that we may see deer in our surroundings. The other day, I'm pulling onto the on-ramp of 270, and just as I was going to really lay into it and get going, a nice doe just starts right out in front of me. Barely missed it. We see them in our area. However, this fall, when I sit in my tree stand, I will be on the lookout for deer. I will be scoping out every area in my surroundings. I will be looking hard. If something moves, I'm going to hone in. I will be watching out for the presence of deer in my surroundings. I think that's the approach Jesus challenges us to take with greed. He doesn't say, well, if you see some at some point, go ahead and get rid of it. Jesus says, be watching for it, because it's out there. So pay attention and find it. Jesus goes on to say, look for all types of greed. Now, typically, when we talk about greed, it's almost always within the context of money. And I think that's appropriate because probably everyone in this room at some point is going to have to wrestle with a little greed over our finances and those resources. It's just part of who we are. We just got to wrestle with that from time to time. However, when he says all types, that tells me there's other areas and other aspects of our life we've got to recognize that greed can exist around, right? I think we can be greedy with our time. That we can look at the margin in our schedule and that time between, bedtime and when we leave the office or whatever your schedule looks like. And we can look at that gap and say, those are my hours. That's when I relax. That's when I unwind. That's my time. And we can begin to grip that so tightly that if in a private conversation with God, he were to say, I really need one more hour out of you at the church each week. Or I really need you to set aside that weekend to be a part of that camp or that mission trip. That if God were to ask us for a little bit more time, it'd be challenging because we got such a tight grip on it already. I think we can be greedy with our family. That maybe your relationship with your spouse has went through something and you've gotten through it and you're on the other side. But man, if God were to want you to open that up because another couple could benefit from your story, you'd be going, no, God, that's mine. That's my personal life. That's my secret. That doesn't get aired out. I think we can be greedy with our kids. I've not hit this point yet. Maybe someday I will. I've had conversations with parents who have been here, though. And maybe God will come to us as parents and want to put one of our children in an environment to where he can do something incredible in their faith. But that environment seems unsafe to us or out of control, or it's an environment that we can't directly impact while they're there. And God may challenge us to open up the grip we have on our kids so he can do something new. But we've got it locked down. Now, that one's not easy. Of anything, that may be the hardest. But nonetheless, we've got to identify areas and resources that we've locked down and make sure we can still loosen it up to give God access to it should he need it. And the third thing Jesus says in his command, his statement on greed is just to assign proper value to our resources. Everything we have, be it a job, financial, relationships, influence, those are all things God has given us to build his kingdom. It's all there, one, for us to enjoy, but secondly, for us to have an impact and to grow God's kingdom and expand it here on earth. And when we view it through that lens, we keep the values in check. And if we view everything we have as something we manage we manage for God's benefit, then that's a deterrent to greed. But if we start to overvalue something God has given us and we take more security in our finances, or we become too locked up on our time, well, then we've overvalued that. And we've made it more than something God has given us to use for His benefit. We start to think that's ours. And it's more valuable in our hearts than maybe it even is. So we just got to make sure we keep the proper perspective and we assign the correct value to the resources God has placed at our disposal. So the first question we got to ask ourselves based on this passage is, what am I holding on to? The second is, what am I building? I want us to look real quick and read Luke chapter 12, verses 16 through 20. And here it's written, and Luke says, and he, which would have been Jesus, told them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. He thought to himself, what shall I do? I've got no place to store my crops. Then he said, this is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store my stuff. And God says to him, you fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get all that you have prepared for yourself? You know, when I ask, what are you building? I ask that with the assumption that in life, most of us are constantly building or developing something, right? People in my age range, we're building a career. Many of us are trying to do things professionally that will set us up for the long haul in our working years. That's just fine. Maybe you're here and your mind's kind of fixated on retirement, and you're wanting to make sure that you get to live out your dreams or just not eat ramen, whatever spectrum you're on. But you're thinking towards building wealth. That's just fine. Maybe you're here and you've painted kind of the ideal picture of what you want your family to look like, and what you want your kids to grow up to be, and how you want you and your spouse to relate, and what color a minivan you want. But you've got this perfect picture of an ideal family life, and you're trying to build that. But most of us are constantly building. And it's not that we're building's the problem, it's how we're building that can become a challenge, and how we relate to the Lord. See, the man in the story was a phenomenal builder, the farmer. He was great. He was already wealthy, meaning he had already done so well. He had mastered the craft. He had saved well. He had taken the risk at the right time that paid off huge dividends. I don't know what all fed into that, but Jesus said he had done great at building wealth and building up his farming operation. The problem is that the way he built, and the mindset and the attitudes and the heart that drove the process led him down a road we don't want to go down. I think there's two key things that fed into his building that became troubling for him in areas that mattered far more than financial success. First thing was he was willing to build at all costs. And he didn't care what it took or what price he paid. And we know this because he looked at all he had already accomplished and said, it's not good enough. I got to go bigger and better. It's onward and upward. So much so that he would tear down his previous success just at the opportunity to gain more. He was going to build at all costs to get to some mystical point where one day it was going to be good enough, and at that point, he'd sit down and enjoy it. Now, just a sidebar on that thought, it's easy to chase a target and say, well, when we have this much, we'll be able to relax a little bit, or we'll be happier. If I have this, when the kids get a little older, it'll be a little bit easier. But that's a moving target. So if you're building something and plan to let off once you accomplish a certain goal, it's likely you'll never reach a goal to where you stop building at all costs, just like this man did. So not only was this man willing to pay any price to win, this man built in such a way that he would be highly successful in one area, but an utter failure in another area that turns out matters so much more than any wealth he could have acquired. See, as Jesus tells this story, the man's foolish, not for gaining and acquiring wealth, but because he didn't take the time to invest and to build up people around him who would one day be able to celebrate and enjoy his life's work. Because the question God asks of the heart of the farmer is, when your life ends, which just so happened to be coming right around the corner, who's even going to be left to enjoy all you've built? Who's even going to care about all you accomplished? And the reality is that we can build and build and build, one day coming to a point to where we realized that we built the wrong thing. And no matter how great success looked here, failure here is a pill we'll never be able to swallow. Right? This past Memorial Day, we had a cookout at my house, and we invited several of our friends over. And a lot of our friends have a lot of kids, like a lot of kids. And so there's a lot of babies running around the Lawson Ranch on Memorial Day. And we had finished the meal, there was a lot of food accompanied with a lot of kids. So we had finished the meal, and we had kind of navigated to our corners of the remaining barbecue, right? You had the kids who were out playing in the sprinkler and jumping on the trampoline and throwing the footballs. You've got the moms who are in their corner, and you've got the dads who are in our corner, and we've circled up our lawn chairs, and we're assuming the post-barbecue position, where you slump down a little further in your chair, and you're rocking the flip-flops, and you're in the meat coma, and that's our world right now. And in a few moments later, we realized that the moms were on a mission to burn off the barbecue. You see, in our backyard, my wife keeps a tractor tire, an old tractor tire, weighs a couple 100 pounds. And as part of her workout routine, she will go out in the backyard and flip the tire. And she'll do it 16, 17 times in a row, just bam, 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 back and forth across the yard. And so her and another couple moms had went out to flip the tire and, gain penance from their sins of overeating or something. So they're flipping the tire. They kind of stop. Dads, we've not moved. And then we look around, and a few of the kids have went over to the tire, and they're going to flip it. And you get just a small portion of them, and you watch them, and they get kind of low, and they pull, and they grunt, and they strain, and nothing happens. No movement. They gain a few more. And they all gathered around, and they kind of pull, they grunt, and they strain, and then that time they get it about right here, just off the ground. You're kind of proud as a dad. They've worked together to accomplish something. Then the movement gains traction. All of the children, which again, a lot, they all go to the tire. My son Eli becomes like the chief of the operation, and he's getting them all organized. And we watch, and they get it up to here. And then they keep going, and they get it up to about right here. And from across the yard, all the dads do the parental thing, and we just shout, "Stop, put it down." They don't. They keep going. They get it up to about right here, and we all take off. Now, flip-flops, meat coma. Wouldn't have needed slow motion to make it more dramatic. But we're trying to get there as quick as we can. And just before they were ready to stand it up and flip it over, a couple of us get there, and we take the tire, and they all run and play and laugh, and we all kind of let out a sigh of relief. Because what happened that day is the kids were highly successful at accomplishing the goal of flipping the tire. What was about to happen is it could have flipped over and a couple kids gotten hurt. And see, they would have been successful on one hand, but success there would have led to failure with a much more difficult result that the success could have never overcome in their lives. And that's what happened in the life of our farmer. He set out to be so successful at farming and gaining wealth, and he did it, but it cost him more than he was ever prepared to pay. And we can replicate the exact same thing in our lives. We're always building, and I think that's a great thing. But we've got to make sure we do it in the right way. We've got to make sure that when we build, we do it in a way that no matter what else we accomplish, we've still leaned into our spiritual walk and the people around us, and we accomplish so much more than just what we were also building on the other hand. Right? I think it's a great thing to build a career. I think as Christians, we should work hard, be great employees, give the company our best. But if you set out to build a career, I hope that at your retirement, you can look over your shoulder and see how all along the way, God used your career as a platform for ministry. Church, that's a career worth building. I think it's a great thing to build wealth. I think it's a great thing to save and invest and try to win financially. But I hope that if you're here today, if you ever sit down and you look at your portfolio or you open your bank statement and are able to go, wow, this is paid off. We've done well financially. You're able to kind of smile and say, yeah, that's great. But do you remember that one time when there was those kids that weren't going to be able to go to camp? So we just dropped off a check and made sure that they could go experience the Lord that week. Or do you remember that one time there was that young couple or that single mom at church and their ends weren't meeting? And because of how God blessed us, man, we were able to go by and take a couple bills and get them caught up and even a little ahead. That's wealth worth acquiring, because it's wealth that does more than just get us money. And parents, we better be very careful and intentional about how we're raising and developing our kids, because we'll view it as tragic if one day we've realized that we've built a great shortstop or a great academic or a kid with a well-rounded resume to attach to their scholarship applications, but who's going to leave our home with a distant relationship with the Lord because we spent so much time and energy in advancing other areas of their life that we neglected their spiritual walk with the Lord, and we didn't grow that area. See, the most tragic thing about our story is not that the farmer did so well and never got to enjoy it. It's that he did so well in areas that really didn't matter, because when his life ended, so did all his impact. And everything he built one day mattered nothing, not just to him, but it didn't matter to anyone else either. And we want to build differently. We're going to build. So let's do it in a way that gets us a better result than the farmer got in his life. The third question we need to ask ourselves is, what legacy are we leaving? And in chapter 12:21, Luke writes, "So is the one who lays up treasures for himself and is not rich towards God." Now here, Jesus circles back to how the farmer invested his life and how he built so well in one area, but has nothing to show for it. And Jesus says the exact same thing happens in our spiritual life, that we can do so well in some areas, but it doesn't really matter because we've not invested in our relationship with Jesus Christ. And when we look at our legacy, at some point, we're going to be remembered for something. So we might as well choose what we want to be remembered for. And if we really want to have a true long-lasting impact, we've got to set out to leave a spiritual legacy, because that's the only thing we can accomplish that really lasts forever. No matter how well we do in the workforce, one day we'll retire, they'll talk about us for a few weeks, someone else will fill our role, and then everything else we accomplish doesn't matter as much. No matter how well we do financially, at one point in our life or in the life of those we leave the money to, money's going to run out. But if we set out to leave a spiritual legacy, if we set out to make an impact on the lives of those around us at work and then at home with those we love the most, if we set out to use our resources whether it's influence, a job, or money, for God's benefit, not just something for us to enjoy, when we adopt that mindset towards life, we've got the opportunity to leave a legacy, a spiritual legacy that will echo for all eternity. When we open ourselves up and God changes the life through people at work, that echoes for all eternity because it changes their life and the life of their family that comes beyond Him. When we use our money for God's kingdom growth, that can last forever. Because if we help fund missions to where people in another place have a relationship with the Lord, we change their life, and we have the opportunity to change the life of families in another part of the country. But we've got to do that on purpose. We're going to leave a legacy. We might as well choose to leave one worth leaving. We might as well choose to leave a lasting spiritual impact on the lives of the people who God's placed us around. So when we look at legacy, I've got a few questions I jotted down just to help us think about what am I really going to leave behind, and what are people going to think based on my life's work. One is, will everything I worked for outlive me? Again, the only things that outlive us are the effort and the energy we put towards expanding God's kingdom and that we put towards our personal relationship with Jesus Christ. Second, am I investing in things that have a spiritual impact and will outlive me? See, it's easy to identify what we should do. The question then becomes, am I actually doing it? Am I actually doing things that will set me up to have a lifelong and an eternity-long impact on the people around me? And third, what do I want my life to be known for? And am I organizing my life now to accomplish this goal? You see, it's on a morning like this at church, it's really easy to decide we're going to leave a spiritual legacy, that we want to have an eternal impact on the world around us. But then we got to go home and make sure we're doing the things that will help us accomplish that. You see, legacies rarely are built in bright, shining, bold moments. And spiritual legacies are almost always left when someone simply does the right thing day in and day out over decades, and then they have a whole life's worth to show for it when they reach eternity. You see, sometimes when Jesus told parables, they're inspirational. We have something to chase after. Today we read a parable and we know what not to do. And we can see who we don't want to become. And this morning and this week, we've got just a couple questions we can walk through and that we can answer in our own lives to help us make sure we're on a path, to help us make sure we don't end up with the same life result that our character did this morning. You know, just a moment, Brian and our band, they're going to come back out, and each Sunday we have a built-in chance for you to respond to the Lord based on something that He may have said to you today or earlier this week. But now's a great opportunity that if God's speaking or doing something in your life, for you to handle that. You can do that in your pew. Also down front, I'll be down here. I'd love to pray with you or encourage you any way I can. But let's have a word of prayer, and then Brian and our band will come out to lead us in our time of response. Lord, we just thank you so much for today, for all that you've done in our service and in our hearts and our lives and the life of our church. I just ask that you would be with us as we respond to what you're doing and try to address any work that you're doing in our lives to where you may want us to change a thought or an action. And God, I just ask that you would be with us for the next few moments and for the rest of the week as we still continue to think and process through what you've taught us today. It's in your name we pray.